The morning sun filtered through the estate garden, where Claire Bennett sat with a book and a glass of fresh orange juice. Birds called from the hedges. The glass rose toward her lips. Then a voice shattered the quiet. "Don't drink the juice." Ethan Walker, the gardener, stood frozen 10 feet away, his pruning shears still in hand. Everyone turned. Jonathan Bennett, Claire's husband, stared at him with cold precision. One sentence could cost Ethan everything: his job, his son's future. But seconds later, when the truth came out, the billionaire began to cry. What was in that glass that changed everything? 2 hours earlier, Ethan Walker had arrived at the Bennett estate just after dawn. The iron gates opened automatically as his old truck rolled up the gravel drive, tires crunching in the stillness. He parked near the service entrance and grabbed his toolbox from the bed. The air smelled like jasmine and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, sprinklers hissed to life. He had been working this job for nearly 3 years. The pay was decent, better than anything else he had found since his wife died. It covered rent on the small apartment he shared with his son Noah, kept food on the table, and left just enough for the occasional book or pair of shoes when the boy outgrew his old ones. Ethan did not complain. He knew how to stretch a dollar. He knew how to work quietly and keep his head down. The estate belonged to Claire Bennett, a woman whose name appeared in business magazines and tech journals. She had built a software company from nothing and sold it for a fortune that most people could not imagine. Ethan did not know the exact number. He only knew that the house had 12 bedrooms, a pool with underwater lights, and gardens that required 2 full-time workers to maintain. He was one of them. Claire was not like the other wealthy people Ethan had worked for over the years. She did not treat him like furniture. She remembered his name. She asked about Noah. Last winter, when the boy had caught pneumonia and Ethan missed 4 days of work, she had not docked his pay. Instead, she sent a basket of groceries to his apartment with a note that said she hoped Noah felt better soon. Ethan still had that note folded in his wallet. Her husband, Jonathan Bennett, was different. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they have been trained to smile at the right moments. He wore expensive suits even on weekends and spoke in measured tones that gave nothing away. Ethan had worked on the estate for 3 years and could count on one hand the number of conversations they had shared. Jonathan did not seem unkind. He simply existed in a world that did not include gardeners. Ethan walked through the side gate and into the main garden. The hedges needed trimming. He could see where the new growth had started to blur the clean lines he had shaped 2 weeks ago. He set down his toolbox and pulled out the pruning shears. The metal was cool in his hands. He moved methodically, cutting away the excess, letting the clippings fall onto the tarp he had spread beneath him. The sun climbed higher. The heat began to settle over the garden like a blanket. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and kept working. He thought about Noah, who was probably awake by now at the neighbor's apartment. Mrs. Callahan watched him in the mornings before school. She was kind and never asked for much, just $20 a week and the occasional favor when her back gave her trouble. Ethan made a mental note to stop by the store on his way home and pick up the cream she liked for her coffee. Around 9 o'clock, Claire came outside. She wore a light blue dress and carried a book under one arm. In her other hand, she held a glass of orange juice. The ice clinked softly as she walked. She settled into one of the wrought iron chairs on the patio and opened her book. Ethan glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. He was used to her presence. She often spent her mornings out here, reading or making phone calls. Sometimes she brought her laptop and worked in the shade. He moved closer to the section of hedge near the patio, careful to keep his distance, but close enough to do the job properly. The shears clicked in a steady rhythm. Claire turned a page. The garden was quiet except for the sound of his work and the distant hum of traffic beyond the estate walls. Then Jonathan appeared. Ethan saw him come out through the French doors that led from the library. He was carrying something, though Ethan could not tell what at first. Jonathan moved across the patio with the same smooth efficiency he brought to everything. He approached Claire and said something Ethan could not hear. She looked up and smiled. Jonathan leaned down and kissed the top of her head. Ethan turned his attention back to the hedge. He did not like to watch them. It felt invasive, like standing too close to someone else's private moment. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Jonathan reach into his pocket. He pulled out a small packet, the kind that might hold sugar or artificial sweetener. He tore it open. Ethan's hand stopped moving. He watched as Jonathan tilted the packet over Claire's glass. A fine white powder spilled into the orange juice. It dissolved almost instantly. Jonathan folded the empty packet and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he said something else to Claire, touched her shoulder, and walked back into the house. Claire did not look up. She was still reading. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers curled loosely. The glass sat on the small table beside her, beads of condensation sliding down its surface. Ethan's chest tightened. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. He told himself he had misunderstood. Maybe it was medicine. Maybe Claire had asked for it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that he simply did not know. But Jonathan had looked around before he did it. Ethan remembered that now. The way his eyes had scanned the garden, quick and deliberate, before his hand went to his pocket. People did not look around like that when they had nothing to hide. Ethan's grip on the shears tightened. He thought about Noah. The boy was 8 years old, and small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes, and a gap between his front teeth that would probably need braces someday. He loved dinosaurs and space and asked questions that Ethan did not always know how to answer. Every night, Ethan read to him before bed. Every morning, he made sure the boy ate breakfast. It was just the two of them now, and Ethan could not afford to lose this job. If he said something and he was wrong, Jonathan would fire him. Men like Jonathan did not tolerate accusations. Ethan would be gone by the end of the day, his name blacklisted, his reputation ruined. No one would hire a gardener who made wild claims about his employer. He would end up working minimum wage at a gas station or stocking shelves at night while Noah stayed alone in the apartment. But if he said nothing and something happened to Claire, he would never forgive himself. She had been kind to him when she did not have to be. She had helped him when Noah was sick. She treated him like a human being. Ethan looked at the glass. Claire's hand moved toward it. She set down her book and reached for the drink. His body moved before his mind finished deciding. He dropped the shears onto the tarp and ran. His boots hit the stone patio hard. The distance closed in seconds. Claire's fingers wrapped around the glass. She lifted it. Ethan's voice came out louder than he intended. "Don't drink the juice." The glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the stone. Orange juice spread across the patio in a bright, sticky pool. Ice cubes skittered toward the edge. Claire jerked back in her chair, eyes wide. Ethan stood 3 feet away, breathing hard, his hands still raised, as if he might need to knock the glass away. The garden went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Claire stared at him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Then Jonathan stepped back out onto the patio. He must have heard the glass break. His eyes moved from Claire to the shattered glass to Ethan. His expression did not change, but something cold settled into his gaze. Jonathan Bennett spoke in the same measured tone he always used. "What's going on here?" Ethan tried to speak. His mouth was dry. He swallowed and forced the words out. "I saw you put something in her drink." The air seemed to thicken. Claire's face went pale. She looked at her husband, then back at Ethan. Jonathan did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. Ethan's knees felt weak. He had just accused a billionaire's husband of trying to poison his wife. There was no walking this back. No matter what happened next, his life had just changed forever. Claire Bennett finally found her voice. It came out quiet, barely more than a whisper. "Jonathan." Her husband looked at her. For the first time since Ethan had known him, Jonathan's composure cracked. Something flickered across his face. Not anger, not guilt. Something else. Something Ethan could not name. Jonathan Bennett did not answer his wife immediately. He looked at Ethan with the same steady gaze he might use to evaluate a quarterly report. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Ethan could feel sweat rolling down his spine despite the morning coolness. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Claire stood up from her chair. The book she had been reading fell to the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. She moved toward her husband, her steps uncertain, as if the patio stones had become uneven beneath her feet. Her voice was stronger now, edged with something Ethan had never heard from her before. Fear, maybe. Or anger. She spoke directly to Jonathan. "Tell me what he's talking about." Jonathan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Ethan. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the patience of a man explaining something obvious to a child. He addressed Claire without looking at her. "I put your medication in your juice. The same thing I do every morning because you refuse to take it any other way." Claire's hand went to her throat. The color that had drained from her face began to return. But slowly, as if her body was not sure whether to believe what it had just heard. She turned to Ethan. Her expression had shifted from fear to confusion. And something in her eyes made Ethan's stomach drop. Jonathan continued, his voice maddeningly calm. "Claire has a thyroid condition. The doctor prescribed medication 6 months ago. She hates swallowing pills, so I crush them and mix them into her morning juice. I've been doing it since September." Ethan's hands began to shake. He clasped them together to make it stop, but it did not work. The pieces of what he had witnessed rearranged themselves in his mind, forming a picture completely different from what he had imagined. Not poison. Medicine. Not murder. Care. Claire looked down at the shattered glass and the puddle of orange juice spreading across the stone. Her shoulders sagged. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning was not cold. When she looked back at Ethan, her expression had softened into something that might have been sympathy. She addressed him gently. "Ethan, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But Jonathan's telling the truth." Ethan wanted the ground to open beneath him. He wanted to disappear into the hedge he had been trimming just minutes ago. His throat felt tight, and when he tried to speak, the words came out rough and uneven. He directed them at Claire. "I'm sorry. I saw him look around before he did it, and I just thought." Jonathan cut him off. His voice had not risen, but it carried an edge now, sharp and precise. He spoke to Ethan for the first time since this had begun. "You thought I was trying to kill my wife." It was not a question. Ethan could not meet his eyes. He stared at the broken glass instead. At the way the sunlight caught the edges and made them glitter. He had been so certain. The way Jonathan had glanced around the garden, the secretive movement, the powder dissolving in the juice. It had all seemed so clear. Jonathan took a step closer. Ethan forced himself to look up. The man's face was unreadable, a mask of controlled composure that gave nothing away. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, each one carefully chosen. "I look around before I add the medication because Claire gets embarrassed about it. She doesn't like the staff knowing about her health issues. I was being discreet, not secretive." Ethan's mind raced back through every interaction he had witnessed between the couple. He thought about the times he had seen Jonathan bring Claire her morning juice. The small kindnesses that Ethan had barely noticed because they seemed so ordinary. A hand on her shoulder, a kiss on her forehead. the way Jonathan always made sure her glass was full. Claire moved closer to her husband. She touched his arm, and Jonathan's expression softened slightly. She looked at Ethan, and her voice carried a gentleness that somehow made everything worse. "You were trying to protect me. I understand that." But Ethan could see it in Jonathan's eyes. Understanding was not the same as forgiveness. He had accused this man of attempted murder in front of his wife. He had shattered their mourning, their privacy, their trust. Men like Jonathan Bennett did not forget things like that. Ethan's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'll pack my things." He turned to leave, his boots crunching on broken glass. Each step felt heavier than the last. He thought about Noah, who would be getting ready for school right now. Mrs. Callahan would make him toast and ask about his homework. The boy had no idea that his father had just destroyed the only stable income they had. Claire's voice stopped him. "Wait." Ethan turned back. She had not moved from Jonathan's side, but her eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made him freeze. She glanced at her husband, some unspoken communication passing between them, then looked back at Ethan. She spoke carefully, as if weighing each word. "Jonathan, can you give us a moment?" Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at his wife, then at Ethan, then back at Claire. Something in his expression suggested he wanted to argue, but he did not. He simply nodded once and walked back into the house. The French doors closed behind him with a soft click. Claire waited until he was gone before she spoke again. She moved toward one of the chairs and sat down, gesturing for Ethan to do the same. He did not want to sit. He wanted to run. But something in her tone made disobedience impossible. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, perching on the edge as if ready to bolt. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun caught her hair, turning it golden at the edges. She looked tired, Ethan realized, not just from this morning's chaos, but from something deeper, the kind of tired that came from carrying weight no one else could see. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "How long have you worked for us, Ethan?" He had to clear his throat before he could answer. 3 years. "A little over." Claire nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already knew. She looked out at the garden, at the perfectly trimmed hedges and the flowers blooming in neat rows. Ethan followed her gaze and saw his toolbox still lying on the tarp where he had dropped it. The pruning shears gleamed in the sunlight. She brought her attention back to him. "In 3 years, have I ever given you a reason to think I was in danger in my own home?" Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am." She leaned forward slightly. "Then why did you risk your job to warn me about that juice?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected anger or disappointment, not curiosity. He struggled to find words that would make sense, that would explain the panic that had seized him when he saw Jonathan pour that powder into her glass. Finally, he managed to speak, though his voice was rough. "Because you've been kind to me, to my son. When Noah was sick, you sent food. You paid me even though I missed work. You treated us like we mattered." Claire's eyes glistened. She blinked rapidly, and Ethan realized with horror that she was fighting back tears. He had made things worse. He had not just accused her husband of trying to kill her, he had also made her cry. But when she spoke, her voice was not angry. It was something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like wonder. "Do you know what it's like to live in a world where everyone wants something from you?" Ethan did not answer. He did not know how to. Claire continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken somewhere inside her. "Every conversation is a negotiation. Every friendship has an agenda. People smile at me because of what I can do for them, not because of who I am. Even my own family calls only when they need money or favors. I built a company from nothing, and the moment I sold it, everyone I had ever known suddenly remembered I existed. She stopped and took a breath. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Jonathan is different. He married me before the money. He loved me when I was nobody. But even with him, sometimes I wonder if I'm surrounded by people who would help me if I fell, or if they would just step over me on their way to something better. Ethan sat very still. He did not know what to say. This was not the conversation he had expected to have after destroying his employer's mourning and accusing her husband of murder. Claire looked at him directly, and her next words came out soft but clear. "You thought I was in danger, and you warned me even though it could cost you everything. You have a son who depends on you. You have bills to pay. You have every reason to keep your head down and mind your own business. But you didn't." She reached up and wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so human and unguarded that Ethan felt his own throat tighten. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied. "That's the kind of person I thought didn't exist anymore in my world. Someone who would do the right thing, even when it hurts." Ethan did not know what to say. The words stuck in his throat. He had been prepared for anger, for dismissal, for the walk of shame to his truck with his toolbox in hand. He had not been prepared for this. Claire stood up. She smoothed her dress and looked toward the house, where Jonathan had disappeared. When she turned back to Ethan, something had shifted in her expression. The vulnerability was still there, but it was joined by something else. Resolution, maybe. Or strength. She spoke with the same quiet authority she probably used in boardrooms. "You're not fired, Ethan. You're not even in trouble. What you did this morning took courage, and I won't punish someone for trying to protect me." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. He could breathe again. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that Jonathan might not feel the same way. He voiced the thought before he could stop himself. "What about your husband?" Claire smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "Jonathan will understand, eventually. He's a good man, even if he doesn't always show it the way other people expect." She walked toward the broken glass and looked down at the mess on the patio. The orange juice had stopped spreading and was beginning to dry in the sun, leaving a sticky residue on the stone. She shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, it was almost to herself. "I should probably just take the pills, like a normal person." Ethan stood up. He felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had not quite solidified yet. He looked at Claire, at this woman who had more money than he could imagine, and more problems than he had ever considered. She seemed smaller somehow than she had before, despite the size of her house and the weight of her bank account. He found his voice again. "Thank you for understanding." Claire turned to face him. The morning light fell across her face, highlighting the lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled less often than she should. She met his gaze without flinching. "Thank you for caring enough to say something. Even if you were wrong, you were right to speak up." She started toward the house, then stopped and looked back at him one more time. Her next words were quiet, but they carried across the patio with perfect clarity. In a world of money and power, the rarest thing isn't wealth or influence, it's a good conscience. Then she was gone, disappearing through the French doors and leaving Ethan alone with the broken glass and the weight of what had just happened. Ethan stood alone on the patio for several minutes after Claire disappeared into the house. The broken glass lay scattered at his feet, like evidence of a crime he could not take back. He bent down and began picking up the larger pieces, dropping them carefully into his palm. The edges were sharp. One of them nicked his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. He barely noticed. His hands moved automatically, gathering shards while his mind struggled to process what had just happened. He had been certain he was about to lose everything. He had already started making plans in his head, figuring out which bills he could skip for a month, whether Mrs. Callahan would watch Noah for free if he promised to pay her back later. He had been preparing for disaster. Instead, Claire had thanked him. She had cried, not from fear or anger, but from something he still did not fully understand. Gratitude, maybe. Or loneliness. The words she had spoken about her world, about people who only wanted something from her, had sounded like a confession, like she had been carrying that weight for so long that it had become part of her, invisible to everyone except herself. Ethan walked to the garden shed and found a broom and dustpan. He swept up the remaining glass, the smaller fragments that glittered like diamonds against the gray stone. The orange juice had left a sticky residue that would need to be hosed down later. He made a mental note to do it before he left for the day. When he returned to the hedge, his pruning shears were still lying on the tarp where he had dropped them. He picked them up and tested the blades, opening and closing them once. They moved smoothly, the metal clean and sharp. He had been in the middle of trimming the north side when everything had fallen apart. The hedge looked uneven now. One section perfectly shaped, while the rest remained overgrown. He got back to work. The familiar rhythm steadied him. Cut, drop, move. Cut, drop, move. The sun climbed higher, and the heat settled over the garden. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His arms ached. But the repetition was comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant, even when the world tilted on its axis. An hour passed, then another. Ethan finished the hedge and moved on to the flower beds, pulling weeds and deadheading the roses. He worked without looking toward the house, though he was aware of it in his peripheral vision, a massive structure of glass and stone that seemed to watch him. He thought about Noah. The boy would be in class now, probably sitting near the back because his eyesight was not great, and Ethan kept meaning to get him glasses, but had not found the money yet. Noah loved school. He loved learning about things that existed beyond their small apartment and their small life. He asked questions about black holes and ancient civilizations, and whether there was life on other planets. Ethan did his best to answer, but sometimes the questions went beyond what he knew. Last week, Noah had asked him what it was like to be rich. Ethan had been washing dishes at the time, his hands deep in soapy water. He had not known how to answer. He told Noah that money made some things easier, but did not make people happier. Noah had thought about that for a moment, then asked if they could at least be rich enough to buy the dinosaur encyclopedia he had seen at the bookstore. Ethan had promised to think about it. He was still thinking about it. $29.95. Not much for some people, a fortune for others. The sound of the French doors opening pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw Jonathan Bennett stepping out onto the patio. The man had changed into more casual clothes, dark jeans, and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He carried a glass of water in one hand. Ethan straightened up slowly, his muscles protesting after hours of bending and kneeling. He waited for Jonathan to speak, but the man just stood there, looking out at the garden as if evaluating the work that had been done. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Finally, Jonathan walked down the patio steps and crossed the lawn toward where Ethan stood. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining the careful distance that people use when they are not sure how close is appropriate. He took a sip of water, then held the glass loosely in his hand. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the edge it had held earlier. It was neutral, almost conversational. The hedges look good. Ethan did not know how to respond to that. He settled for a simple acknowledgement. Thank you. Jonathan looked at him directly for the first time since coming outside. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between resignation and something that might have been respect. He shifted his weight slightly, and when he spoke again, the words came slower, as if he was choosing them with care. He addressed Ethan with deliberate formality. My wife told me what you said to her. About why you warned her. Ethan's stomach tightened. He gripped the garden trowel in his hand a little harder, feeling the wooden handle press into his palm. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing. Jonathan continued, his gaze steady. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry this morning. You accused me of trying to kill Claire. That's not something a man forgets easily." Ethan forced himself to meet Jonathan's eyes. "I know. I'm sorry." Jonathan held up one hand, a gesture that was not quite dismissive but close. "I'm not looking for another apology. I'm trying to tell you something." He took another sip of water, then set the glass down on a nearby garden bench. When he looked back at Ethan, something had shifted in his expression. The mask of composure had cracked just enough to show what lay beneath. Not anger. Something more complicated. Jonathan spoke quietly, almost as if talking to himself. "Claire and I have been married for 12 years. I've watched people try to use her, manipulate her, take advantage of her kindness. Some of them were friends, some were family. After a while, you start to assume that everyone has an angle. Everyone wants something." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "We employ 18 people full-time. Gardeners, housekeepers, security, a chef, assistants. They're all polite. They all do their jobs. But not one of them would risk their paycheck to warn Claire about something they thought was dangerous. They would call the police anonymously after the fact and say they had no idea. That's how people protect themselves." Ethan listened without interrupting. He could hear birds calling from the trees at the edge of the property, their songs oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening beneath them. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. "But you ran toward the danger. You shouted in front of witnesses. You made yourself the target. That's not self-preservation. That's something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He held it out to Ethan, who took it cautiously. The card was simple, cream-colored with black lettering. It had Jonathan's name and a phone number, nothing else. Jonathan explained in a tone that brooked no argument. "If you or your son ever need anything, you call that number. Medical bills, school expenses, car trouble, whatever. You call, and we'll handle it. No questions asked." Ethan stared at the card. His throat felt tight again. The way it had when Claire had told him he was not fired. He looked up at Jonathan, searching for the catch, the condition, the price that always came with generosity from people who had everything. But Jonathan's face showed nothing except a kind of weary sincerity. He picked up his water glass and turned to walk back toward the house. He made it 3 steps before Ethan found his voice. Ethan called after him, his words rough but genuine. "Mr. Bennett." Jonathan stopped and turned partway back. Ethan struggled to find the right words. "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just couldn't stand by and do nothing." Jonathan studied him for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there. But it was real. He spoke with something close to warmth. "I know. That's why it matters." Then he was gone, walking back into the house and leaving Ethan standing in the garden with a business card in his hand, and questions he could not quite articulate swirling through his mind. Ethan finished his work as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. He cleaned his tools, rolled up the tarp, and loaded everything back into his truck. His body ached in the familiar way it did after a long day of physical labor, but the ache felt different somehow. Lighter, maybe, or just less important. He drove home through the late afternoon traffic, the business card tucked into his wallet next to the note Claire had sent when Noah was sick. The old truck rattled at stoplights, and the air conditioning had stopped working 2 summers ago. But none of that bothered him the way it usually did. When he pulled up in front of his apartment building, Noah was sitting on the front steps with Mrs. Callahan. The boy jumped up when he saw the truck and ran over, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Ethan got out and caught his son in a hug, lifting him off the ground for a moment before setting him back down. Noah looked up at him with bright eyes. "Dad, guess what we learned about in science today?" Ethan smiled. "What?" The boy launched into an explanation about photosynthesis and chlorophyll, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Ethan listened, one hand resting on his son's shoulder, and thought about Claire's words on the patio that morning. In a world of money and power, the rarest thing was not wealth or influence. It was a good conscience, the ability to do the right thing even when it cost you something. The willingness to speak up when silence would be easier. Ethan had spent most of his life trying to be invisible, to not cause trouble, to keep his head down and take care of his son. But this morning, he had been seen. Not just by Claire or Jonathan, but by himself. He had discovered something about who he was when the moment demanded it. And maybe that was worth more than all the hedges he would ever trim, all the gardens he would ever tend. Maybe that was the thing Noah needed to learn most. Not how to survive in a world that did not care, but how to be the kind of person who cared anyway. They walked into the apartment building together, Noah still talking about plants and sunlight, and Ethan listening with the kind of attention that made his son's face light up. Behind them, the sun dropped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Tomorrow, Ethan would return to the Bennett estate. He would trim more hedges and plant more flowers. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just the gardener. He was the man who had shouted when it mattered, and that made all the difference.